Hi, I want to talk to you today a little bit about clerical livings, which is something that you've already seen it come up in Northanger Abbey with regard to three different people. You're right now reading, I think, the parts of Pride and Prejudice that deal with Mr. Collins. So you will see it there, and then a little bit later with Wickham. And you will see it again in Mansfield Park with regard to Edmund Bertram, and you will see it again in Persuasion with regard to Charles Hayter. Why is this? It's because Jane Austen, of all the professions, knew the profession of clergyman the best. Her father was a clergyman. Her father had two livings, as I think I told you before, just like Mr. Morland. The question you're probably asking is, what is a living? Well, essentially, it is being made the minister of a parish church, being allowed to live in the house there that is intended for the minister. It's either a rectory, if you're a rector, or a vicary, if you're a vicar, getting a set sum of money every year, and also having glebe land, which is land that you can farm or have farmed for you in order to make even more money. The question is, how do you train to get yourself into a position to get a living? Secondly, once you're trained, how do you actually affect the process of attaining such a spot? Because there are many more clergymen than there are livings available. And thirdly, who is it that is in charge of handing out these livings? Today you would probably answer, well, it must be the church. The Anglican Church must be the ones who effectively have these livings in what in the 18th century would have been called in their gift, that they're the ones who can assign the livings. In fact, in Jane Austen's time, that was not true. The Anglican Church did hold some livings in their gift, but most of the livings were in the gift of the family, the gentry family, the landowning family that owned the land within which the parish and that parish church was based. Therefore, it was not the church that determined who got the living, but the landowners themselves. In some cases, once you had a living, you were able to resign that living and pass it along to your son. This is something that we see Mr. Morland doing with regard to James Morland. And in fact, as I think I told you before, Jane Austen's father George also does this with the parish of Dean, St. Nicholas, or Stevenson, I'm sorry, St. Nicholas Steventon. He resigns his rectorship there and passes it along to his son James. In any case, that's where the livings come from. What do you have to do to be in a position to even be eligible to get a living? Well, you have to go to either Oxford and Cambridge, and you have to prepare yourself to do what in the 18th century is called taking orders, which means to become ordained. You go through Oxford and Cambridge, you take the various, they're not really courses because you have tutorials with dons there, but you take the path that will lead you to a position of being able to be ordained eventually, and then you would be eligible to have a living of your own. However, as I said, there aren't enough livings to go around. So, if you were in the most fortunate position you could be in, your father would be a landowner who had in his gift a living, or two livings, or three livings, or five livings. Usually in this case you were not the eldest son, because the eldest son would be preparing to take over as the owner of the estate after the father passed away. You would be a second son or a third son, or so on down the line. The two most popular professions and common professions for second and third sons of landowners were either the clergy or the military, most often the Navy, and we'll get to the Navy later on in the course. In any case, if you do that, you're set. A family living is already being held for you. You come out of Oxford or Cambridge, you get ordained, boom, you've got it. I think this is what happens to Henry Tilney. We know that even though this living at Woodston is not near Northanger Abbey, I think it's about 20 miles away, that it's on land that the general owns. Therefore, it seems to me that the general probably has this living in his gift and therefore has saved it or secured it for Henry, and that's the living that Henry has. This is the ideal. A little bit down the line is to be connected, though not by blood, to a family that has livings to give. This is the case, as you will see reading on, I think you will be reading this over the weekend, of Wickham, in the story that he tells Elizabeth about how Mr. Darcy, because Mr. Darcy liked him so much, was holding a family living for him when he finished at university. And then there's a long story that goes along with that. He effectively decides he doesn't want to ask for a sum of money from Darcy instead, etc., etc. We'll get to that later on. The third way is essentially to network while you're at Oxford or Cambridge to endear yourself to the other students there whose fathers are landowners who hold livings. I guess we call that networking today. You would call it connections, making connections. In the 18th century, getting to know someone, becoming their friend, and then having them recommend you to their father, who might then recommend you to someone they know who has a living, that kind of thing. A little bit like the job market today. So those are the various ways that you could get a living. Now I just want to go down the list of the clergymen we've seen so far and tell you how each of them fits in. Mr. Moreland, we've already covered. He's got 2 livings. He obviously had pretty decent connections, and he must, because he also has an independence, a substantial independence, which means his family had money, even if they did not hold a living in their gift. And possibly they did. We just don't know. James Moreland is obviously counting on his dad to resign his living and pass it along to James, and we can see this in process when we get to the sort of moment of truth between James and Isabella and their pre- and post-marital situation. Henry Tilney, again, as I said, I think Woodston is a family living, so he's known all along that he's going to get it, and that's very nice for him. But now we come to someone who does not have connections, Mr. Collins. Why doesn't Mr. Collins have connections? Because he's Mr. Collins. He's an off-putting doofus. Does he have any friends at Oxford or Cambridge? Hard to imagine that he does. He certainly has not made the connections he needs to get a living. But something miraculous has happened to Mr. Collins. Just at the point, I'm sure he is thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do while I wait for Mr. Bennett to die so I can finally take over Longbourn, since I know nobody and no one's going to give me a living. As if out of the clouds comes a woman who owns land, who owns an estate called Rosings, and very near that estate there is a parish that has a church, and since her personality is a whole lot like Collins's, except she likes to have her feet kissed and he likes to kiss people's feet, he gets that living. Unbelievable. He's ecstatic. He's over the moon. But he's used to, I think, all his life being someone who's an outsider, being someone that people dislike. not knowing quite how to act, being obsequious as a way of hoping to get along. And that's where you get this super interesting mix of Mr. Collins, of being so proud that he has this living, and so proud that he can kiss Lady Catherine's feet whenever she wants him to, and listens to her orders like she's God, but at the same time seems a little bit uncomfortable in any kind of social situation, clearly is not concerned with the church in any way, except as a way of showing himself to Lady Catherine as being someone worthy to be her toady. You don't really see him concerned with his parish. He's concerned with watching to see when Miss de Boer comes riding by in the carriage so that he can run down and make up compliments for her. So this is Mr. Collins, and I think it really tells us a lot about his situation. He just got lucky, and he can hardly believe it. And then finally Wickham, who is a very suave, debonair young fellow, and who, despite his character flaws that we find out later, as a youth, was really one of Mr. Darcy's favorite people, right along with his own son, Fitzwilliam Darcy. And in order to prepare Wickham for his future life, Mr. Darcy not only pays his way through university, but holds a family living that is in his gift for Wickham when he gets out. So that's how livings work. If you think about them today, they don't sound much like the way the church works today at all. I think the closer analogy would almost be academia. And especially if you throw in two other ranks or levels of clergymen, you can see how this template kind of works with the university template, because in fact, all universities and colleges grow historically from religious institutions in England. Oxford, all English, and I guess American to a degree, institutions. Oxford and Cambridge were initially religious institutions, and then slowly during the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, became more and more secularized, or actually maybe starting back earlier at the Renaissance, more and more secularized until they become what they are today, which are essentially secular or non-religious institutions, though of course you can still read theology at Oxford and Cambridge if you want to, and many, many people do, and end up going into the church. So here are the two other ranks of clergy that I want to talk to you about. The first are all those people who don't get livings. What are they going to do? Well, what they do is they become curates. Curates are people who don't have livings, but effectively act as adjunct, or, well, I'll just use the word, non-tenured clergymen. Because the system that is in place, as we've seen with Mr. Moreland, allows you, if you are someone with the wherewithal to have such things offered to you, it allows you to hold multiple livings. You can have 1 living, 2 livings, 3 livings, 4 livings, 5 livings. They don't have to be close together. You don't have to go there at all if you don't want to. But obviously, somebody's got to run that church and that parish. So what do? You hire a substitute, and that substitute is a curate. Someone who's also gone to Oxford or Cambridge, also has been ordained, but couldn't get, now I'm going to switch my metaphor here, a tenure-track job. You don't get a tenure-track job, then you come in as some sort of instructor or lecturer. You're paid less, you have no job security, but that's what you do. So here's how that system would work. Let me just see if you can see this when I bring it up close. Let's imagine you have 3 livings. Hope this works. 3 livings. Living 1 is cranking you 500 pounds a year. Living 2 is cranking you 300 pounds a year. Living 3 is cranking you 450 pounds a year. Well, if you were a cheapskate, though most clergymen were, you could get a curate for only 40 pounds a year. So, you put a curate in to take care of this one, take 40 off your income, so you're netting, what, I'm showing the wrong one. Here we go. That was my scratch out one. You're netting 260, okay? You put a curate in your 450, you're netting 410. And the first living, perhaps, you just keep for yourself and actually live there and give the sermons and all that kind of good stuff. So your actual income is 500 plus 260 plus 410 for a whopping 1170, which is a lot of money, really, not a bad income whatsoever. And you're doing nothing at these 2 livings at all. Now, there is another variation in the case of Henry Tilney. Henry Tilney only has 1 living. It seems be a very lucrative one, so it could be as high as 1,200, 1,500, we don't know what. He only goes there now and then to preach. He doesn't live there full time, so he employs a full-time curate, even though it's only he only has that 1 living. So in that case, you know, maybe he's a little more generous and he's paying the guy more money. We don't know. But the main point, and I'm coming back around here, is this. You could hold multiple livings during that time, and you could make a lot of money from them, and the people that you put in to take care of your parish and effectively live in the rectory, they've got to live in the rectory or the vicary, so they had a free house, they got to work the glebe land themselves. So the 40 pounds a year was just kind of, again, not icing on the cake, because it was still very little, but you could live halfway decently even on that if you had a free house and other means of income, like the glebe land. But it really was kind of a racket, and not very nice for the curates who got put into these positions. I will say, however, if you really get into reading ecclesiastical history, you will find out there are other kinds of curacies that are not bad. You can be a perpetual curate, which I think is actually what James Austen becomes at Steventon, where you're making just as much as the rector. So there are lots of variations, but I'm talking about plain old garden variety curate who did not get a living and is getting paid pretty low. Okay, now I'm going to switch back to my university analogy. As I said, I think these are the people who don't get tenure track jobs, which are few and far between. The analogy is almost exact. And then if you look at above faculty, what's the next big rank? I'm not talking about chairman of a department, I'm talking about the next big time rank in sort of a whole higher sphere. It's called a dean, right? Well, in England at this time, the person who was the head man at a large cathedral, and that cathedral would be the power, the church power over many, many parishes spread out all around it. And so this dean would have power over the various rectors, vicars, curates, whatever in this larger area. The person who held that position was called a dean. So you were the dean of Salisbury Cathedral, just like you today would be the dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Directly below you were the faculty, tenure track or tenured, yeah. And then next step down there were those people who had not been able to get what would be considered an academic living and work as lecturers and so forth. And of course they can move up, and they do move up, because they're writing things and trying to get noticed, and it might happen, and that's what does happen to many curates along the way. In any case, this system is one that Jane Austen would have known upside down and backwards. She uses it all the time, and I just wanted to lay it out there so you will have some idea about what is being talked about, because the idea of livings, who gets a living, what they do with their living, and so on and so forth, comes up again and again and again in her works. All right, that's it for today.